The first time I saw Lake Phantom, I almost turned around and left. The water was unnaturally dark, like spilled ink spreading across the earth. Even the sky, a clear blue when I parked my RV, seemed to dim as I stepped closer to the shore. But I'd come here for a reason, and turning back wasn't an option. I'd spent the past 2 years avoiding water. Not that I was afraid of it, I told myself that every day. But after the accident, the idea of swimming, even dipping a toe into a pool, made my chest tighten. Lake Phantom was supposed to change that. A remote place to face my fears and maybe find a story worth telling for my travel blog. I met Cole at the tiny dock on the southern shore. He was leaning against his old fishing boat, a battered hat pulled low over his eyes. He gave me a long, appraising look as I approached. "You're the guy who parked up at the RV lot?" he asked. "That's me," I said, "Wes Harper." "Cole Marks." He spat into the water, the ripples vanishing almost instantly. "You fishin', or are you here for the stories?" "Both, maybe," I said, not bothering to hide my recorder. "I've heard the lake's got a reputation." Cole snorted. "Reputation, sure. People drown here, or disappear. Nothing mysterious about it. Just folks thinking they can outsmart the water. They can't." "Do you believe the legends?" I asked. His face hardened. "Believe this. The lake doesn't give second chances. Stay out of the deep water." The first night was uneventful, but the dream started as soon as I closed my eyes. I was swimming in the middle of the lake, the water pulling me down, a hand gripping my ankle. I woke, gasping, clutching at my sheets as if I could pull myself out of the nightmare. My skin was damp with sweat, but it felt colder, wetter, as if the lake had reached into my RV. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination. That changed when I met Gina. She was kneeling by the water's edge, a portable lab kit spread out on the rocks beside her. Her dark hair was tied back, and her fingers worked quickly, collecting samples and scribbling notes. "Careful," I said as I approached. "That water's not exactly inviting." She looked up, smirking. "You must be the guy with the RV. Cole mentioned you." "Small world," I said. "What are you working on?" "Research," she said. "This lake is unusual. No fish, no insects. The water absorbs light instead of reflecting it. It's like the ecosystem here just stopped." "Does that worry you?" I asked. "It fascinates me," she replied. "But there's definitely something off. I've been hearing strange things since I got here." "Like what?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "Voices. Probably just the wind, but..." She trailed off, her eyes fixed on the lake. That evening, the lake came alive. I was sitting on the shore, watching the water, when I noticed the ripples. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns, forming concentric circles that never broke. My breath caught as I realized the ripples were moving toward me, not away from their center. "Wes?" The voice was faint, almost a sigh. I froze, the sound stirring something deep in my memory. It sounded like my father. "Dad?" I whispered before I could stop myself. "Wes, come closer." I stood, my legs moving without thought, pulling me toward the water. The ripples grew stronger, their patterns hypnotic. My heart raced as the voice grew louder, clearer. "Wes, stop!" Gina's voice broke the trance. She grabbed my arm, yanking me back just as my feet touched the water. The ripples vanished instantly, the lake's surface eerily still. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her face pale. I don't know, I stammered. I thought I heard something. Her grip tightened. Don't listen to it. Whatever you think you hear, it's not real. The next morning, I found Cole by the dock again. I told him about the ripples, the voice. His face darkened and he muttered something under his breath. You should leave, he said. Both of you. I came here to figure this out, I said. What's really happening? Cole sighed, rubbing his temples. People have been drowning here for decades. The lake doesn't want you to know why. It just wants more. It'll show you things, make you think you're safe. Then it takes you. Why do you stay? I asked. Because someone's got to warn people like you, he said. But I'm telling you, Wes, don't go back out there. I didn't listen. That afternoon, Gina and I hiked to the cliffs overlooking the lake. The view was breathtaking, but the sense of unease lingered. The water below was black, almost liquid shadow, and I swore I saw shapes moving beneath the surface. That's not just water, Gina said, her voice low. She was studying a small cavern carved into the base of the cliffs. I think there's something down there. We climbed down, careful on the slick rocks. Inside the cavern, the air grew colder, and the walls were marked with deep, unnatural gouges. At the back of the cave, we found an old miner's helmet half buried in silt. What is this doing here? Gina asked, brushing dirt off the faded metal. There was never mining around here. Maybe there was, I said, pointing to a faded map scratched into the wall. It showed a network of tunnels beneath the lake, their exits all marked with X. What if the lake wasn't always here? Before she could respond, the water began to rise. The cavern filled with a low hum, vibrating through the stone, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to step into the rising water. Wes, no! Gina grabbed my arm, dragging me out of the cave as the shadows in the water seemed to reach for us. That night, the shadow came for me. I woke to the sound of water dripping, though the RV was completely dry. My windows fogged over, and the faint smell of algae filled the air. Then I saw it. A dark shape slithering through the condensation on the glass, forming tendrils that seemed to reach for me. The whispers returned, louder now. Come back, Wes. It's your fault. My heart pounded as the tendrils stretched closer, their tips dripping with black water. I scrambled out of the RV and ran, Gina appearing from her tent as I stumbled into the clearing. It's here, I gasped. The shadow, it's real. Gina and I went to Cole's cabin that morning. He didn't seem surprised when we told him about the cavern, the helmet, the shadow. It's not just a lake, he said. This whole place is cursed. The miners disturbed something when they dug too deep. They drowned when the tunnels flooded, but whatever they unleashed didn't stay buried. How do we stop it? Gina asked. You can't stop it, Cole said, but you can quiet it. Return what you found to the water. Give it back what it's owed. That evening, Gina and I rowed to the center of the lake. The water was calm, but the darkness below felt alive, shifting as if something massive stirred beneath us. This is insane, Gina whispered. What if it doesn't work? We don't have a choice, I said, holding the miner's helmet tightly. The whispers had returned, growing louder as we reached the deepest point. As I lowered the helmet into the water, the lake erupted. Shadows burst from the surface, coiling around the boat. The whispers turned to screams, accusing and pleading all at once. Gina clung to the boat as the tendrils dragged me toward the edge. Let go, she screamed, grabbing my arm. I'm sorry, I shouted into the chaos. I'm sorry for running, for hiding, for everything." The tendrils hesitated, their grip loosening. I hurled the helmet into the water and the lake stilled instantly. The darkness receded, leaving the surface eerily smooth. We made it back to shore as dawn broke, our bodies bruised and our nerves shattered. Cole was waiting for us, his expression grim. "You did it?" he asked. "For now," I said, watching as the lake shimmered faintly in the morning light. But as I packed up my RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake wasn't finished. In my rearview mirror, I saw the water ripple unnaturally, as if the shadow was still watching, waiting for me to return. The road to Ash Hollow was a nightmare. My RV rattled and groaned as I steered it over roots and potholes, the overgrown forest pressing in on all sides. It was as if nature itself was trying to push me back. I didn't care. I'd come here for a story, and I wasn't leaving until I had it. Ash Hollow wasn't even on most maps anymore. The old campground had been abandoned decades ago after a fire ripped through the area. Locals whispered about strange things happening there. Fires that wouldn't die, laughter in the woods, people disappearing. Folklore, I thought, until I met Nate. I first saw him at the park's visitor center, leaning against the counter like he had all the time in the world. He watched me with sharp, assessing eyes as I asked the receptionist for directions to Ash Hollow. She stammered something about it being unsafe, but Nate cut in. "You're heading to Ash Hollow?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "That's the plan," I replied, trying to sound confident. "Bad idea," he said. "The road's barely passable, and there's nothing left to see. Just ashes and ghosts." "I'm writing an article on forgotten places," I said. "Ash Hollow sounds perfect." Nate frowned. "Sometimes places are forgotten for a reason." I ignored his warning. A forgotten campground with a haunted reputation? It was exactly the kind of story I needed to revive my career. Still, his words stuck with me as I parked my RV on the edge of the hollow and stepped into the clearing. The air felt wrong. It wasn't the faint smell of smoke lingering in the damp air or the eerie silence that hung over the campground. It was the heat. The rest of the park had been cool and breezy, but here the air was heavy, suffocating. Sweat clung to my skin as I set up my equipment, snapping photos of the charred remains of picnic tables and melted lanterns. As the sun dipped below the trees, I spotted movement at the edge of the clearing. A woman emerged from the woods, her dark hair pulled back into a ponytail and a hiking pack slung over her shoulder. "Didn't expect to see anyone else out here," she said, smiling. "You camping?" "Investigating," I said, introducing myself. "Grant Rivers, freelance journalist." "Lisa Ward," she replied. "I'm running a survival training course nearby. Thought I'd check this place out. Heard it's spooky." "That's one word for it," I said, gesturing to the charred ruins around us. "Creepy enough for your group?" Lisa laughed. "Definitely, but it's quiet now. You staying overnight?" "That's the plan," I said. "Why?" Her smile faded. "Be careful. People say the fires here never really went out." That night, I found out what she meant. I was sitting by a small campfire reviewing my notes when I saw the first flicker of light in the woods. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight, but it didn't move like a reflection. It bobbed and weaved between the trees, growing brighter with each pass. Curious, I grabbed my flashlight and followed. The glow led me deeper into the woods, where I found a fire pit surrounded by melted camping gear. The coals glowed faintly, even though there was no smoke, no heat. I crouched to get a better look when a sound stopped me cold. Laughter. It was soft at first, like a child playing hide and seek, but it grew louder, sharper, mocking. My flashlight wavered as I scanned the trees, but there was no one there. Then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the firelight, its form glowing like embers in the dark. It wasn't human. Its shape flickered and shifted, its edges blurred by heat. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as the figure tilted its head as if watching me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The laughter stopped, replaced by a deep, crackling voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Why did you come here?" I didn't answer. I ran. By the time I made it back to my RV, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I locked myself inside, double-checking the windows before collapsing onto the couch. The air felt heavier than before, the faint smell of smoke seeping through the walls. The next morning, Lisa found me sitting outside, pale and rattled. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, half joking. I told her about the firelight, the figure, the laughter. To my surprise, she didn't laugh. Instead, she frowned, her expression turning serious. "You're not the first to see it," she said. "People say the fire takes the shape of those who died here. It messes with your head, shows you things you don't want to see." "Like what?" I asked. "Regrets, guilt, stuff you've buried." I didn't want to believe her, but I couldn't shake the memory of that voice. "Why did you come here?" Later that day, we decided to explore the abandoned ranger station at the edge of the campground. Nate had mentioned it in passing, calling it the place where it all started. The station was little more than a burned-out shell, its roof collapsed and its walls blackened by soot. Inside, we found an old journal buried beneath a pile of debris. The entries were short and frantic, describing a wildfire that had swept through the campground decades ago. The ranger blamed himself, writing about how he'd ignored warnings, how he'd failed to evacuate the campers in time. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. The fire isn't natural. It knows me. It won't let me leave. Lisa flipped through the pages, her face pale. "Do you think he died here?" I finished. "Probably. And I think whatever this thing is, it's tied to him." That night, the fire came for us. We were sitting by the RV when the air grew unbearably hot. Flames flickered at the edge of the clearing, spreading unnaturally fast despite the damp ground. The laughter returned, louder this time, mingling with voices that sounded painfully familiar. "Grant," a voice called, soft and accusing. I froze. It was my ex-wife, Emily. "Why did you let me go?" the voice asked, cracking like burning wood. "It's not her," Lisa said, grabbing my arm. "It's the fire." The flames surged closer, forming shapes, figures of people, their faces flickering like holograms. One of them looked like Emily, her eyes burning with anger. "You left me, Grant. You gave up." My chest tightened, guilt and shame twisting inside me. "I didn't." "It's lying," Lisa shouted. "You have to fight it." I closed my eyes, taking a shaky breath. "You're not real," I said. "You're just fire." The figure flickered, its form distorting. The laughter turned into a roar as the flames lashed out, forcing us to retreat toward the ranger station. Inside, the fire couldn't follow, but the heat was oppressive, the air thick with smoke. Lisa found a page in the journal that mentioned a way to stop the fire. Return the guilt to where it began. It's tied to this place, she said, to the ranger and his guilt. If we can burn this journal where the fire started, maybe it'll break the cycle. The thought of venturing back into the flames made my stomach turn, but I nodded. Let's do it. The flames seemed to sense our intent, growing wilder as we approached the fire pit where I'd first seen the embers. The laughter turned into screams, the fiery figures clawing at us as we placed the journal in the pit. My hands shook as I lit the match, the fire roaring to life the moment the journal caught. The screams grew louder, deafening as the flames consumed the pages. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the fire vanished. The air cooled, the laughter silenced. The campground was dark and still. Lisa and I left that night, neither of us looking back. I scrapped my original article, writing instead about the dangers of guilt and the weight of the past. Sometimes, though, I dream of Ash Hollow, and in the distance I see a faint flicker of fire waiting for me to return. The first thing you notice about Whispering Hollow isn't the darkness of the caves or the ancient red sandstone cliffs, it's the sound. Even before you step into the hollow, there's a strange quality to the air. It carries whispers, faint and fleeting, that vanish the moment you try to listen too closely. For someone like me, a sound engineer obsessed with acoustics, it was irresistible. I'd come to Hocking Hills with my RV, chasing a rumor. Whispering Hollow was supposed to have the most bizarre echoes in the region, reflections of sound that twisted and stretched into something unnatural. Legends about people disappearing there only sweeten the deal. If I could capture these phenomena, it might salvage my career after the disaster of my last project. The hollow itself was a short hike from the campground where I parked my RV. On the way, I ran into Matt Harris, a ranger who looked as worn as the trails he patrolled. "You're not headed to the hollow, are you?" he asked, his tone wary. "Why?" I replied. "Something I should know?" He hesitated as if weighing whether or not I'd listen. "It's not safe. Weird things happen down there. People hear voices, lose track of time, get disoriented. Some don't come back." "Sounds like a natural acoustic phenomenon to me," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Perfect for my work." Matt didn't smile. "Stay out of the caves, Dylan, and if you hear something calling your name, don't answer." The trail down into Whispering Hollow was narrow and overgrown, the dense trees muffling the world around me. By the time I reached the clearing, I felt like I'd stepped into another realm. The air was cooler here. The sunlight filtered through layers of leaves until it barely touched the ground. And the sound, it was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Every step, every rustle of leaves seemed to echo back, slightly distorted, as if the hollow was imitating me. I set up my recording gear near the largest cave entrance, a jagged maw in the rock that seemed to breathe cold air. My microphones picked up faint vibrations, a low hum that was almost imperceptible but persistent. As I adjusted the equipment, a voice startled me. "Getting anything good?" I turned to see a woman with a camera slung around her neck, her blonde hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She smiled brightly, though there was something guarded in her eyes. "Dylan," I said, introducing myself, "I'm recording echoes. You?" "Chloe," she replied. "I'm a travel vlogger. Whispering Hollow's supposed to be haunted, right? Thought I'd check it out." "Haunted is one word for it," I said, gesturing toward the cave. "You're welcome to join, but I'm here for science, not ghost stories." She grinned. "Science is fine, as long as it's spooky." The first sign that something was wrong came that evening. Chloe and I had set up a small camp near the clearing, and I was reviewing the day's recordings while she edited footage on her laptop. That's when I noticed the hum, deeper, louder than before, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. "Do you hear that?" I asked. She nodded slowly. It's coming from everywhere." I checked my equipment, but the readings didn't make sense. The frequency of the hum wasn't consistent. It shifted subtly, almost like it was alive. Then came the whispers. "Dylan!" I froze. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It sounded like my late mother, soft and familiar, calling from deep within the cave. "Dylan!" It came again, more insistent. Chloe grabbed my arm. "You heard that, right?" I nodded, my mouth dry. "It's just the acoustics," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Let's go check it out." We entered the cave cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The hum grew louder with each step, resonating off the stone walls until it felt like the cave itself was alive. The echoes here were wrong, distorted in ways I couldn't explain. A simple snap of my fingers came back to me as a cascade of mismatched sounds, growing louder instead of fading. "This is amazing," I whispered, though my awe was tinged with unease. Chloe wasn't as impressed. "It feels heavy in here, like we're being watched." We followed the sound deeper, the whispers guiding us like breadcrumbs. The passages twisted and branched unpredictably, and soon I realized I had no idea how to get back. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. Then we found the carvings. They were etched into the stone, ancient symbols that resembled people covering their ears, surrounded by jagged lines and spirals. Chloe snapped a photo, her hands trembling. "What do you think they mean?" she asked. "Maybe the people who made them knew about the acoustics here," I said. "It could have been a warning." "A warning for what?" The hum suddenly stopped, plunging the cave into an eerie silence. That's when the voices returned. "Chloe, Dylan." They weren't whispers anymore. They were loud, clear, and coming from all around us. Panic set in as the voices grew louder, overlapping and echoing until it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. I grabbed Chloe's hand and ran, hoping to retrace our steps, but the cave seemed to shift around us. Passages that should have led out looped back on themselves, and the markings on the walls seemed to follow us no matter where we went. "Dylan, stop!" Chloe shouted, pulling me to a halt. "We're going in circles." "I know," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "But what do you want me to do?" The voices answered for her. "Failure. Coward. Leave." They were targeting me now, mimicking my own thoughts and fears. I staggered back, clutching my head as the sound became unbearable. Chloe's voice cut through the noise, grounding me. "Dylan, listen to me. They're not real." "They sound real," I whispered. "That's what they do," she said firmly. "They're trying to break us." We stumbled into a small chamber where the hum returned, pulsing like a heartbeat. At its center was a natural stone column, worn smooth by centuries of erosion. The carvings here were more intricate, depicting people fleeing from a massive spiral that radiated out from the column. "This has to be the source," I said, setting up my equipment again despite Chloe's protests. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. "Dylan, we need to leave," she said, her voice cracking. "This place isn't right." "I just need one recording," I insisted. "I need to understand this." The moment I pressed record, the cave erupted. The hum became a deafening roar, and the echoes twisted into something primal and malicious. Shadows flickered on the walls, taking on human shapes that lurched toward us. Chloe screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her back toward the passage. The shadows followed, their movements erratic and disjointed, but relentless. My equipment was useless now, and all I could think about was getting out alive. The voices reached a crescendo as we stumbled toward what I hoped was the exit. They screamed our names, our fears, our regrets, each word slicing through my mind like a blade. I saw Chloe falter, her face pale as she clutched her head. "It's not real," I shouted, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. We burst out of the cave into the open air, gasping for breath as the silence enveloped us. We didn't speak as we returned to the campground. The hum was gone, but its weight lingered, a phantom sensation that refused to fade. Chloe packed her gear quickly, her hands trembling. "I'm not staying here," she said. "This place, it's wrong." I didn't argue. I packed up my RV and left the hollow behind, but the sounds stayed with me. When I reviewed my recordings later, I found something chilling. Beneath the hum, faint but unmistakable, was my own voice. "Come back." When I pulled into Blood Moon Campground, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, like the solitude I chased on these trips, but the kind of silence that makes you check over your shoulder more than once. The lake at the center of the clearing glistened under the fading light, perfectly still, like a polished mirror. The campground itself was nearly empty, just one other tent pitched a few sites away. I parked the RV near the lake, killing the engine. Stepping outside, I took a deep breath of the cool evening air, but the stillness lingered, heavy and unnatural. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, I'd picked this place for the view of the blood moon tonight. They said it would be the most vivid in decades. As I set up my chair by the water, I noticed someone approaching. A woman in her late 20s or so, wearing hiking boots and carrying a thermos. She waved. "Hey," she called out. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," I said. "Tom." "Abby," she replied, sitting on a nearby rock. "You here for the blood moon too?" "Yeah, supposed to be incredible. You camping alone?" She nodded. "I've been on the road for weeks. Thought I'd stop here for the night, though, honestly, this place feels a little off." I raised an eyebrow. "Off?" Abby glanced toward the tree line. "Too quiet, isn't it? No birds, no bugs, just nothing." I hadn't noticed until she pointed it out. The realization made my skin prickle, but I shrugged it off. "It's the wilderness. Maybe nature's taken a nap." She didn't laugh, just sipped her drink and stared out over the lake. The moon rose as night settled in, a brilliant crimson disk hanging low in the sky. I'd seen photos of lunar eclipses before, but this was something else. The moon glowed with an intensity that seemed to stain the entire campground red, its reflection shimmering on the still water. Abby had gone back to her tent, and I was alone again. I leaned back in my chair, letting the eerie beauty of the scene wash over me. That's when I noticed it. Strange carvings in the trees around the lake. They looked like crude runes etched deep into the bark. How had I missed them earlier? As I stood to take a closer look, the first whisper reached me. It was faint, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. But there was no wind, and the sound wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the lake. I froze, scanning the water. A ripple moved across the surface, though nothing had disturbed it. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint red glow rising from the lake, like embers floating in the dark. The glow grew brighter, coalescing into a figure, a ghostly silhouette with burning red eyes. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The figure hovered above the water, its gaze fixed on me. Then it smiled, its mouth twisting into a cruel mockery of human expression. "Tom," it whispered, my name barely more than a breath. I turned and ran. I burst into the RV, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, though I doubted a deadbolt would stop whatever that was. I grabbed a flashlight and my hunting knife, trying to steady my breathing. A knock on the door made me jump. "Tom, it's Abby," called a voice from outside. "What's going on?" I hesitated, then cracked the door open. Abby stood there, her face pale in the moonlight. "Did you see it?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "See what?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. I heard whispers and thought. Before she could finish, the whispers returned, louder this time, circling us. Abby's eyes widened as she turned toward the lake. "They're here," she whispered. We sat inside the RV as I tried to explain what I'd seen. Abby listened, her hands gripping her thermos tightly. When I described the glowing figure, she paled further. "I found this earlier," she said, pulling a weathered journal from her bag. The pages were brittle, filled with spidery handwriting. "It was lined by the trail. Look at the last entry." She flipped to the back and pointed. The writing was frantic, scrawled as if by a trembling hand. "The moon bleeds and they rise. They come for the guilty, for the broken. They come for us." "Who's a they?" I asked. Abby opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, the RV lights flickered and went out. The whispers grew louder, accompanied by a faint tapping on the windows. I tightened my grip on the knife as Abby crept to the window and peeked out. "They're surrounding us," she whispered. Outside, more figures appeared, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. They moved slowly, deliberately, their forms flickering like dying flames. The whispers grew louder, forming words now. "Join us. Let go. It's your fault." My stomach twisted. "We can't stay here," I said. Abby nodded. "There's an old historian in the town nearby, Caleb. He knows the stories about this place. He might know what to do." We waited for the figures to drift farther from the RV before making a run for it. The trek to Caleb's cabin was tense, the forest bathed in an unnatural red light. The whispers followed us, and every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of glowing eyes in the distance. When we reached the cabin, Caleb answered the door immediately, as if he'd been expecting us. He was an older man, his face lined with age and worry, but his eyes were sharp. "You brought them here," he said, his voice low. "They were already here," Abby shot back. "We need to know what's happening." Caleb led us inside and began to explain. The campground, he said, was the site of blood sacrifices centuries ago. The rituals had left a stain on the land, binding the spirits of the sacrificed to the blood moon. "They feed on guilt," Caleb said, his gaze piercing mine. "They'll use your past against you. If you let them, they'll take you." Caleb told us there was only one way to stop the specters. The protective runes carved into the trees had to be restored. They were meant to trap the specters in the lake, but over time the symbols had faded, leaving the campground vulnerable. "You have until the moon sets," he said. "If they are not bound by then, they'll take you and anyone else they can find." We split up to carve the runes, moving quickly through the forest. The specters grew more aggressive, their whispers cutting deeper. As I worked, I began to hear my brother's voice. "Tom, you left me. You let me drown." I froze, my chest tightening. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But then I saw him, standing in the distance, his face pale and accusing. "Why didn't you save me?" he whispered. I dropped the knife, my breath coming in short gasps. The guilt I'd carried for years crashed over me, threatening to drown me. "Tom!" Abby's voice snapped me out of it. She grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the illusion. "It's not real. Keep going." We reached the final tree just as the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon. I carved the last rune into the bark, the knife slipping in my trembling hand. As the symbol took shape, the whispers turned into screams. The specters gathered around the lake, their forms flickering violently. They let out one final, piercing wail before vanishing into the water, leaving only silence behind. As the sun rose, the forest came alive again. Birds chirped, and the air felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Caleb was gone, leaving only his carved walking stick by the cabin door. Abby and I returned to the campground, shaken but alive. The lake was still again, its surface reflecting the morning sky. "Do you think it's over?" Abby asked. "For now," I said, staring into the water, but deep down, I knew the blood moon would rise again. The road leading to Whispering Pines Glade twisted like a scar through the dense forest. The tall pines loomed over my RV, their branches knit so tightly together that the sunlight barely broke through. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, and that's exactly what I was looking for. I parked at a secluded spot near the campground, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air was heavy, damp with the earthy scent of moss and pine. As I unloaded my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I'd learned to trust my instincts as an investigative journalist. Something about this place felt wrong. I'd come here after hearing rumors of a strange sickness spreading through the area. Disappearances, erratic behavior, whispers of something unnatural in the woods. The kind of story that, if true, could put me back on the map after years of chasing ghosts. The first night was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I settled into my RV, flipping through notes I'd scribbled from local news articles. The stories all followed the same pattern. Campers wandered off into the woods and didn't come back. Those who did return were different. Pale, distant, as if a piece of them had been left behind. Around midnight, I heard it. Whispers, faint and distant, like the sound of wind brushing through dry leaves. I turned off the lights and peered out the window, my breath fogging the glass. There was no one there, just the darkness pressing against the trees. I told myself it was the wind. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I met Lila. She appeared as I was photographing a patch of strange fungal growths near the edge of the campground. Her boots crunched on the gravel path, her sharp green eyes sizing me up. "You're the journalist," she said. It wasn't a question. "Zane," I replied, extending a hand. She didn't take it. "Lila," she said, brushing past me to examine the fungi, "you shouldn't be here." "That's what I've been hearing. Care to tell me why?" She glanced over her shoulder, her face serious. "You really want to know? These woods have a sickness. It's old. It spreads, and if you stay too long, it'll take you too." "What kind of sickness?" I asked, pulling out my notebook. "You'll see," she said cryptically before disappearing into the trees. That evening, I decided to follow the trail deeper into the woods. The pines grew denser, the air cooler. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. About a mile in, I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. The tent was torn, its poles bent and broken. Rusted camping gear lay scattered around, coated in a fine layer of moss. But what caught my attention was the symbol etched into the dirt around the tent. A crude circle with jagged lines radiating outward like a sun. I crouched down, running my fingers over the grooves. The edges were fresh, as if someone, or something, had carved it recently. Then I heard it again. Whispers. Closer this time, just beyond the trees. I stood, shining my flashlight into the forest. Shadows shifted between the trunks, but there was no one there. By the time I returned to the RV, it was dark. The whispers followed me all the way back, fading only when I locked the door behind me. I sat at the small dining table, flipping through my notes, when a knock on the door made me jump. I opened it to find Lila standing there, her face illuminated by the glow of my porch light. "They're watching you now," she said. "Who's watching me?" "The hollowed ones." Lila explained as we sat inside the RV. The hollowed ones, she said, were victims of an ancient force tied to the forest. They were once people, but the sickness hollowed them out, leaving only shells behind. They moved through the woods, luring others to join them. She told me about the mother tree, an ancient, twisted thing at the heart of the forest where the sickness began. "If you destroy it," she said, "maybe you can stop this." "Why don't you do it?" I asked. Lila's jaw tightened. "Because I've already been touched by it." That night they came. I woke to a faint tapping on the windows. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, my ears straining against the silence. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like fingernails dragging across the glass. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out. They were there. A group of them, standing in the darkness just beyond the reach of the RV's lights. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes sunken. They stood motionless, watching me. Then, in unison, they smiled. The whispers filled my ears, a cacophony of voices overlapping, speaking in fragmented sentences. "Join us. Let go. Become whole." I stumbled back, slamming the curtains shut. The next morning, Sheriff Colt found me pacing outside the RV, clutching a thermos of coffee like it was a lifeline. "You look like hell," he said, lighting a cigarette. "What'd you see?" I told him about the hollowed ones. His face darkened. "People disappear out here all the time," he said. "You go looking for answers, you'll end up like them." Why don't you do something about it? I asked. Colt exhaled a cloud of smoke, shaking his head. Some things ain't meant to be fixed. Despite Colt's warning, I decided to find the mother tree. Lila agreed to guide me, though she was reluctant. We ventured deeper into the forest, the air growing colder with every step. The trees became twisted and gnarled, their bark blackened and cracked. The whispers grew louder, echoing all around us. Then we saw it. The mother tree. Its massive roots sprawled across the forest floor like veins, and its trunk pulsed with an unnatural light. Around it stood dozens of hollowed ones, their heads bowed as if in prayer. "We have to burn it," Lila said, her voice trembling. As we approached, the hollowed ones turned to face us. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were marionettes controlled by invisible strings. One of them lunged at Lila, and she screamed, falling back. I grabbed a fallen branch, swinging it wildly, but the creature didn't flinch. Its cold, empty eyes locked onto mine as it whispered, "You can't save them." I lit a flare and threw it at the base of the tree. The flames caught quickly, spreading up the trunk. The hollowed ones screamed, their voices blending with the whispers, creating a sound that made my ears ache. The tree writhed, its branches twisting as the fire consumed it. The hollowed ones collapsed one by one, their bodies turning to ash. By dawn, the forest was silent again. Lila and I stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the last embers of the mother tree smolder. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, but a heaviness still lingered in my chest. As I packed up my RV, I noticed something strange, a small patch of fungi growing on the underside of my boots. I scraped it off, but the sight left me uneasy. As I drove away, the forest faded into the distance, but the whispers remained, faint and distant, echoing in my mind. The desert at night is unlike anything else. A black canvas scattered with stars, vast and unyielding. That's why I parked my RV at the edge of Black Horizon Canyon. The quiet, the isolation, and the view of an unbroken night sky were supposed to give me clarity. After all I'd been through, maybe I'd finally find peace. I stepped outside, my boots crunching on dry soil, and tilted my head back to take it all in. The Milky Way stretched above me, a brilliant smear of light against the endless dark. The air was cool, the kind that nipped at your skin but felt clean going down. I'd come here to escape, to stop replaying the crash in my mind, the one that had ended my career as a military pilot. Out here, the stars didn't care about my guilt. Then I saw it, a faint flicker on the horizon, just above the canyon's edge. It wasn't a plane, no sound, no blinking red light. It was something else. It hovered there for a moment, pulsing softly before it winked out of existence. I told myself it was nothing, just some atmospheric trick, but the uneasy feeling it left in my chest lingered. The next morning, I met Elliot. I'd driven a few miles into the canyon's edge to stretch my legs when I saw him leaning against an old wooden fence near a dusty cattle pen. He looked like he'd been carved out of the desert itself. His face weathered, his hands rough, his eyes sharp under the brim of a sun-bleached hat. "You're camping out here?" he asked, his voice carrying the low rumble of disapproval. "Yeah," I said, dusting off my hands. "Nice and quiet. Great view of the stars." Elliot grunted, spitting into the dirt. "Quiet's not always a good thing. You seen the lights?" I hesitated. "You mean that thing I saw last night? Thought it was a plane." He shook his head. "Not a plane. Not anything good. Best you pack up and leave." "Why?" I asked, half smiling, trying to hide my unease. Elliot's eyes narrowed. They don't just watch, they take. Before I could press him, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the barren landscape. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Elliot had said. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I set up my telescope, telling myself I wasn't looking for the lights. I was here to stargaze, to focus on something bigger than myself, something beyond the burden I carried. But when the stars came out, so did the lights. At first, it was just one, far off in the distance, hovering above the canyon like a lonely firefly. Then another appeared, closer this time, its soft blue glow casting faint shadows across the desert floor. They moved slowly, deliberately, like they were searching. My chest tightened. I wanted to go inside the RV, to close the curtains and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't look away. The lights pulsed brighter, and a strange hum filled the air. It wasn't loud, but I could feel it in my bones, a low vibration that made my teeth ache. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the lights were gone. The following day, I met Marissa. I was checking the engine on the RV, my hands slick with oil, when she walked up. She wore hiking boots and carried a field journal under her arm, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She had the air of someone who'd seen things she couldn't explain, but didn't want to admit it. "Nice spot," she said, glancing at the RV. "Hope the lights didn't bother you." I froze. "You've seen them too?" "Everyone out here has," she said matter-of-factly. "I'm Marissa. I'm with a research team studying atmospheric phenomena in the canyon." "What are they?" I asked, wiping my hands on a rag. Marissa hesitated. "We don't know. They don't behave like anything natural. They're intelligent, deliberate." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I told her about the lights I'd seen and the hum that followed. "It's not just you," she said. "People who see the lights, some of them disappear, and the ones who come back aren't the same." I wanted to dismiss her as a conspiracy theorist, but something about her tone made me believe her. The next night, the lights returned. I stayed inside the RV this time, the curtains drawn tight. But the lights didn't care about barriers. They hovered outside, their glow seeping through the cracks, casting shifting shadows across the walls. The hum returned, louder now, almost like a voice calling out from the void. My radio crackled to life. "Caleb," a voice whispered. It was faint, broken by static, but it was unmistakably my name. I grabbed the radio, my hands trembling. "Who is this?" No response. The lights pulsed brighter, and the shadows inside the RV began to move, twisting and stretching like living things. I slammed the radio down and grabbed my flashlight, stepping outside despite every instinct screaming at me to stay put. The lights hung in the air, motionless. Then, slowly, they began to circle me, their glow pulsing in time with my racing heartbeat. I felt exposed, like they could see every part of me, my thoughts, my memories, my regrets. "You couldn't save them?" a voice whispered, low and accusatory. I spun around, but there was no one there. The lights moved closer, and the hum grew deafening, drowning out my thoughts. By morning, I was ready to leave. The RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, and no amount of coaxing or cursing could bring it back to life. Marissa arrived just as I was slamming the hood shut in frustration. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the canyon. "They're getting stronger," she said. "The more you fight, the more they feed. Feed on what? I demanded. Fear, guilt, whatever you're carrying, they use it against you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. The crash came flooding back, fire, screaming, the helplessness of watching everything fall apart. I'd been running from it for years, but out here, there was nowhere to hide. Marissa grabbed my arm. We need to go, now. We hiked toward the petroglyphs Marissa had mentioned, the air growing heavier with every step. The symbols carved into the rock were ancient, depicting figures reaching toward strange lights in the sky. In the center of the carvings was a large, circular symbol that seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. This is where they come from, Marissa said. I think the petroglyphs are some kind of anchor. Before I could respond, the lights appeared, brighter and closer than ever. They swirled above us, their hum rising to a deafening roar. The shadows they cast danced across the petroglyphs, making the carvings seem to come alive. They want you, Marissa shouted over the noise. You have to let go. Let go of what? I yelled back, panic clawing at my throat. Your guilt, whatever's holding you here, it's their fuel. The lights descended, and I felt their pull, a magnetic force dragging me toward the petroglyphs. Memories flashed before my eyes. My squadron, the crash, the faces of the people I couldn't save. The weight of it all threatened to crush me. With a surge of desperation, I picked up a rock and swung it at the central petroglyph. The symbol cracked, and the lights pulsed violently, their hum turning into a piercing wail. The ground beneath us shook, and the light scattered, shooting into the sky like a swarm of fireflies. The shadows vanished, leaving only the quiet of the desert. Marissa and I stood there, breathless and trembling as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. Back at the RV, the engine roared to life on the first try. I looked at Marissa, who gave me a small, weary smile. You're free, she said. Don't waste it. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The canyon was still and empty, but for a split second I thought I saw a faint flicker of light on the horizon. I kept driving. The lake was everything I hoped it would be. Perfectly still, its surface mirrored the towering evergreens and jagged volcanic rocks surrounding it. It was the kind of place that reminded me why I fell in love with geology in the first place, raw, untouched by time, and utterly indifferent to human presence. It was also the kind of place where the quiet wrapped itself around you, leaving you alone with your thoughts. Exactly what I needed, or so I thought. I parked my RV in the small lot at the edge of the Deschutes National Forest and set up my site overlooking the lake. I planned to spend a week collecting rock samples, hiking the trails, and maybe rediscovering the sense of purpose I'd lost over the years. After losing my job and drifting aimlessly for months, I thought this trip might be the reset I needed. But from the moment I arrived, something felt off. That first night, I sat by the campfire staring out at the lake. The water reflected the moonlight like a sheet of glass, so still it almost felt wrong. Around midnight, I heard faint splashing, like someone was wading in the water. I got up and scanned the shoreline, but there was no one there. Just the trees, dark and silent, pressing in around me. The next morning, I met Camila. I was walking along the shoreline searching for rock formations to sample when I spotted her crouched near the water's edge. She was younger than me, mid-20s at most, with dark hair pulled into a loose braid and a small backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked up as I approached, smiling brightly. "You're not a ghost, are you?" she asked. "Not the last time I checked," I replied, raising an eyebrow. "Why?" She stood, dusting her hands off. "This lake has a reputation. People disappear here." "Disappear?" I echoed, trying not to sound skeptical. "Yup," she said, tapping her phone's screen to show me a series of photos. They were grainy, zoomed-in shots of people standing near the lake. Each of them had faint, glowing marks on their skin. Everyone who's disappeared had one of these. "Looks like camera glare," I said, brushing it off. "You think this is real?" She shrugged. "That's what I'm here to find out. I'm Camilla, by the way. I'm documenting the lake for my blog." "Neil," I said, "I'm just here for the geology." "Well, Neil," she said, giving me a conspiratorial grin, "let me know if you notice anything unusual." That evening, I did. It started with a burning sensation on my forearm, like I'd brushed against something hot. When I rolled up my sleeve, I saw it, a faint, glowing mark etched into my skin. It looked like cracks in stone, branching out in jagged lines. I stared at it, my pulse quickening, and when I stepped closer to the lake, the mark grew brighter. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd brushed against something while hiking. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But as the night wore on, the mark didn't fade. And when I looked out at the lake, I swore I saw faint shapes moving just beneath the surface. The next day, I found Camilla at her campsite and showed her the mark. Her face paled, and for once, she didn't look amused. "You need to stay away from the lake," she said, her voice low. "That's how it starts." What starts?" I asked, more annoyed than scared. "What's going on?" "The mark. It's like a connection," she said. "It pulls you closer to the water, and if you give in, you don't come back." I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh or admit it was a joke. She didn't. "Look, my brother disappeared here 2 years ago," she continued, her voice trembling. "He had the mark too. I've been trying to figure out what happened ever since." I wanted to tell her she was crazy, but the mark on my arm still burned, and when I closed my eyes I could hear faint whispers, soft and insistent, calling me back to the lake. By the third day, the mark had grown brighter, pulsing with light whenever I neared the water. At night, the whispers grew louder, filling the RV with a sound like wind rushing through cracks. The dreams were worse. I saw myself walking into the lake, surrounded by glowing figures, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Camilla insisted on investigating the lake together. She carried a jagged piece of volcanic glass around her neck, claiming it had protective properties. I didn't believe in talismans, but I was desperate enough not to argue. We followed the shoreline, finding abandoned campsites and strange carvings etched into the rocks, symbols that seemed to hum faintly, like they were alive. My mark burned hotter the closer we got to the water, and I felt an almost physical pull toward the lake. "Neil, stop!" Camilla said, grabbing my arm. I hadn't even realized I'd taken a step into the shallows. The cold water lapped at my boots, and for a moment, I thought I saw hands reaching up from the depths. That night, I couldn't resist the pull. The whispers grew deafening, calling my name over and over. I stumbled out of the RV, my legs moving as if on their own. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, its surface glowing faintly. I heard Camilla shouting behind me, but her voice felt distant, drowned out by the melody of the whispers. I reached the water's edge, my reflection staring back at me. The mark on my arm blazed with light, and as I stepped into the water, I saw them. figures rising from the depths, their glowing forms distorted and wrong. "Neil, stop!" Camilla's voice cut through the haze. She grabbed my arm and pressed the volcanic glass against the mark. Pain shot through me, sharp and blinding, and the mark dimmed. The figures in the water recoiled, their forms flickering like dying flames. The whispers turned into a roar and the water churned violently. Camilla dragged me back to the shore, her face pale but determined. "We have to end this." Together, we scattered volcanic ash along the shoreline and lit bundles of sage, the smoke curling into the night air. The lake's glow dimmed, and the whispers faded to a low murmur. But, as we worked, I could feel the entity's anger, its presence pressing down on us like a weight. When we finished, the water stilled and the marks on our skin faded. The forest fell silent, and for the first time in days, the air felt lighter. The next morning, I packed up my RV, ready to leave. Camilla stayed behind, determined to keep investigating the lake. I couldn't blame her. She still had questions, and maybe she'd find the answers she was looking for. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The lake was quiet, its surface unbroken. But, as the trees swallowed the view, I thought I saw a faint glow beneath the water. Some things are better left untouched, but some marks never really fade. The Black Hills felt like the right kind of isolation. After losing my wife, I'd learned to live with solitude. It was easier than facing people's sympathy or the advice I didn't ask for. Out here, surrounded by towering pines and open sky, it felt like I could breathe again, or at least pretend to. I parked my RV in the last slot on the loop, close to a narrow dirt trail that led deeper into the forest. It was the kind of place Sarah and I used to explore together. She loved the wilderness. Now, being out here without her felt like trying to fill a cup with holes in the bottom. The first night was strange. The forest was too quiet. No wind rustling the trees, no chirping crickets, just an oppressive stillness that pressed against the walls of the RV. Around midnight, I heard the first sound, a soft snap, like a branch breaking. Then footsteps circling the RV, slow and deliberate. I stayed still, my breath caught in my chest, waiting for them to pass. They did, eventually, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, as I sat outside with my coffee, a man emerged from the trail. His clothes were dirty, his face pale and gaunt, but he waved as if we were old friends. "Hey there," he called, his voice hoarse. "Mind if I sit?" "Sure," I said, wary but polite. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days, but there was something in his expression, something too eager, that set me on edge. "I'm Max," he said, dropping onto the bench across from me. "Been out here for a few days. Saw your RV and thought, finally, someone else." "You camping alone?" I nodded. "Ethan." He gave me a tight smile, then glanced toward the trail. "You notice anything weird out here?" "Weird how?" "Sounds," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Or someone watching you." My stomach tightened. "Why?" Max leaned in, lowering his voice. "It's the stranger. Been following me since I got here." "Stranger?" He nodded. Pale, skinny, doesn't say a word, just watches. Every time I stop, he's closer. I think he's trying to get me to follow him, but I won't. Can't trust him. I didn't know how to respond. The way Max said it, it sounded like he believed it, even if it sounded crazy. Still, it struck a chord. I thought about the footsteps I'd heard the night before. Maybe there was someone else out here, someone playing games. "Have you seen him?" Max asked. I hesitated. "No." "You will," he said, his voice grim. "He always shows up." Max stayed nearby for most of the day, wandering back and forth between my campsite and the trail. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his nervous energy infectious. By dusk, I found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see the figure he described. That night, I heard the knocking. It started faint, like someone tapping on the RV's door. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, but the clearing was empty. The forest loomed like a wall, dark and impenetrable. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, gaunt and pale, dressed in tattered clothes. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking. No response. I pointed the flashlight at the figure, but the beam seemed to dissolve into the shadows. When I took a step closer, it was gone. The next morning, Max was back, looking worse than before. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling. "You saw him, didn't you?" "I don't know what I saw," I admitted. "You saw him," Max insisted. "He's getting closer." "What does he want?" I asked. Max shook his head. "To take us. That's what he does. Lures you deeper into the woods, and you never come back." His words sat heavy in my chest. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was just a trick of the light, but the image of that figure lingered in my mind. I started to notice things around the campsite. Scratches on the RV's windows, footprints in the dirt. At first, I thought they were Max's, but they were too large, the stride too long. Max became more erratic, jumping at every sound, accusing me of inviting the stranger closer. "You're broken," he said one night, his voice sharp. "That's why he's here. He can smell it on you." I stared at him, anger flaring. "You think you're any different? You're the one running." "Maybe I am," Max said, his eyes wild, "but at least I'm not feeding him." The tension between us grew unbearable. By the third night, I was ready to leave, but part of me wanted answers. I stayed up late, listening to the sounds outside. That's when I realized Max was gone. I stepped out into the clearing, calling his name, but there was no response. A faint trail of footprints led into the woods. My gut told me to stay put, but something stronger, a need to know, to understand, pushed me forward. The forest was darker than it should have been, the moonlight swallowed by the canopy. The trail twisted and looped, the trees seeming to close in. I called for Max again, my voice bouncing back in unsettling echoes. Then I saw the clearing. Max was there, standing perfectly still. The stranger stood opposite him, their faces inches apart. Max was whispering, his words too soft to hear. The stranger tilted its head, as if listening. "Max," I called, stepping into the clearing. Max turned to me, his expression blank. "It's okay, Ethan. He said I can go if I bring him someone else." "What the hell are you talking about?" "He wants you," Max said, his voice trembling. "You're what he's been waiting for." The stranger shifted, its head turning toward me. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back as Max lunged, grabbing my arm. "I'm sorry," he said, his grip like iron. "It's the only way." I fought him off, shoving him to the ground. The stranger stepped closer, its movement slow but deliberate. I scrambled for my flashlight, clicking it on and aiming it at the figure. The light flickered, but the stranger recoiled, its pale form distorting like smoke. "Max, get up!" I shouted, but he just sat there, staring at the ground. The stranger advanced again, its form solidifying. Desperate, I grabbed a branch from the ground and set it ablaze with my lighter. The flames cast jagged shadows across the clearing, and the stranger stopped, its head tilting as if in confusion. I held the torch high, forcing the stranger back. It hissed, a sound that cut through the air like glass before retreating into the trees. The fire crackled, its light flickering against the dark. I dragged Max back to the campsite. He was quiet, his energy spent, but his eyes were still filled with fear. "He'll come back," he muttered. "He always comes back." At dawn, I packed my things. Max refused to leave, insisting the stranger would follow me if I tried. I didn't argue. Whatever was happening in this forest, I wanted no part of it. As I drove away, the forest seemed to breathe around me, its shadows stretching long across the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw the stranger standing in the middle of the clearing, his pale form still and watching. I don't know if it will follow me, but I know one thing. There are places in the world that aren't meant to be understood. The Black Hills are one of them. The first thing I noticed about the campsite was how quiet it was. Not peaceful. The Adirondack Park could do peaceful. This was the kind of quiet that crept into your skin, a silence too heavy for a place teeming with life. I parked my RV near the edge of the lake, the water a still, glassy expanse surrounded by pines that stretched like cathedral spires. I came here to find inspiration, but even now I wasn't sure it would come. Music had always been my refuge, my way of making sense of things. But after the divorce, it was like the notes had dried up, leaving me with a blank score and no direction. Teaching didn't fill the void anymore either. So I took this trip, hoping the solitude would help me rediscover what I'd lost. I spent the first evening trying to compose, my keyboard and sheet music spread across the tiny table in the RV. The ideas didn't come. Frustrated, I stepped outside to clear my head, the cool night air biting my skin. That's when I heard it. It started faint, like wind threading through the trees. A melody, soft and haunting, rising and falling in perfect harmony. It was beautiful, the kind of tune that pulled at something deep inside you. I strained my ears, trying to place it. A flute? Maybe a violin? It seemed to drift from the woods, from the far side of the lake. I stayed outside, listening, until it faded into the silence. The next morning, I drove into the nearest town to grab supplies and, maybe, answers. The general store was small, filled with the smell of wood smoke and coffee. As I picked up a bag of trail mix, an elderly woman behind the counter gave me a curious look. "You're not from around here," she said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "Just visiting," I replied. "Staying by the lake. It's a nice spot." Her expression darkened. "You hear anything strange last night?" I hesitated. "Music, maybe?" It sounded far away. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "You need to leave." "What?" I asked, startled. "That melody, it's not something you want to follow," she said. "It's old, older than this town. It lures people into the woods, and they don't come back." I forced a laugh, hoping to shake off the chill her words sent down my spine. "You're saying the lake is haunted?" "Call it what you want," she said, reaching into her apron pocket. She pulled out a small charm made of twigs and string, handing it to me. "Keep this with you. And if you hear that tune again, don't follow it." I didn't believe her, not really, but I took the charm anyway. Back at the campsite, the melody was waiting. It started as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, weaving through the trees like a whisper. I stood by the water, clutching the charm in my pocket, telling myself it was just the wind or another camper playing music. But no one else was around, and the tune was too perfect, too deliberate. I tried to focus on my composition, but the melody burrowed into my mind, pulling at memories I'd been trying to forget. My ex-wife's laughter on our wedding day, the sound of my students' applause at my last recital. It wasn't just music, it was a mirror, reflecting everything I'd lost. By the time I went to bed, the melody had seeped into my dreams. I woke with a start, the notes still echoing in my head. The next day, I decided to find the source. Armed with my recorder and notebook, I followed the path around the lake, the melody faint but constant. It drew me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the air felt heavier. I found signs of something strange, an old shoe half buried in the dirt, a rusted violin leaning against a tree, its strings humming faintly in time with the melody. Eventually, I reached a clearing. The lake's edge was overgrown, the water dark and still. At the center of the clearing stood a single, gnarled tree, its branches reaching like skeletal arms. Beneath it lay scattered remnants, clothing, backpacks, and instruments all weathered by time. I stepped closer, my recorder capturing the melody as it grew louder. In the water's reflection, I saw them, figures watching me from the edge of the lake. They were translucent, their faces hollow, their forms flickering like shadows on the surface of the water. My heart raced. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my recorder, and the figures vanished. But the melody didn't stop. That night, the melody became unbearable. It filled the RV, drowning out my thoughts, echoing from the walls. I clutched the charm, but its woven twigs felt fragile in my hands. The music wasn't just in the air, it was inside me, wrapping around my mind like a vice. "Daniel?" The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakably hers. My ex-wife. "Daniel, come find me." I staggered outside, drawn toward the lake. The melody surged, each note tugging at the memories I'd buried, the arguments, the regret, the ache of losing something I couldn't fix. The charm snapped in my hand, its twigs crumbling to dust. Before I knew it, I was back in the clearing. The tree stood like a sentinel, its branches swaying despite the still air. The figures were there again, their forms clearer now. They watched me with empty eyes, their mouths open in silent song. "Daniel." Her voice came again, and I turned toward the lake. A figure stood in the water, her silhouette familiar, her hand outstretched. "Come back to me." I stepped forward, the cold water lapping at my boots. "Stop!" The shout cut through the melody like a blade. I turned to see Eleanor standing at the edge of the clearing, a lantern in her hand. Her face was lined with fear, her voice firm. "Don't listen to it. It's not her." I froze, the melody faltering. The figure in the lake twisted, its form warping, its hand stretching toward me. Eleanor raised the lantern, its light blazing brighter than it should have. The figures recoiled, their forms flickering like dying flames. "Get back here," she shouted, and I stumbled toward her, the melody distorting into a harsh, discordant wail. The ghostly forms surged, but Eleanor held her ground, chanting something under her breath. The light from the lantern grew brighter, forcing the figures back into the water. The melody shattered, leaving a deafening silence. Eleanor didn't say much as she led me back to the campsite. She looked exhausted, the lantern's light dim now. "They're not spirits," she said finally. "Not the way you think. They're echoes. Shadows of people who gave in to the melody." "Why me?" I asked, my voice shaking. She glanced at me, her expression weary. "It preys on pain, regret, longing. You were an easy target." We reached my RV, and she handed me a new charm, this one wrapped with a thin silver thread. "Keep this close, and leave first thing in the morning. This place doesn't let go easily." I left at dawn, the lake fading into the distance as I drove away. The melody still lingered in my mind, but it was quieter now, like a memory fading with time. I didn't know if I'd ever truly be free of it, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't let it pull me under. As I reached the edge of the park, I caught a faint strain of music in the air, soft and haunting. I didn't stop. Some melodies are meant to be forgotten. The road to the campsite was rougher than I'd anticipated. My RV groaned as I navigated the uneven dirt trail, the headlights casting long, jittery shadows across the towering pines of Coconino National Forest. By the time I arrived, the sky was already painted with streaks of indigo, the first stars glimmering faintly above. I parked in a secluded clearing, far from the designated campgrounds, the kind of place no one bothers you. That's what I wanted. Solitude. It was supposed to be the perfect trip, capturing the Milky Way in all its glory over the rocky plateaus. But even as I set up my gear, there was a heaviness in the air, something about the silence that pressed down on me. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. By the time I had my tripod and camera ready, the first hiccup hit. My camera's battery was nearly drained, despite being fully charged that morning. I cursed under my breath, swapping in a spare. As I tightened the tripod's mount, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, a flicker of a shadow where there shouldn't have been one. "Hello?" I called out, but the only answer was the wind. I'd barely gotten my first long exposure shot when a voice startled me from behind. "Nice spot you picked." I spun around to see a man standing just a few feet from the edge of the firelight. He was older, maybe late 40s, with a wiry frame and a face worn by the sun. His hands were stuffed casually in the pockets of a faded jacket. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, stepping closer. "Saw your light and figured I'd say hi. Name's Caleb." "Ryan," I replied, still trying to get my heart rate under control. "Didn't think anyone else camped this far out." He shrugged. "Not many do. This part of the forest has a reputation." I raised an eyebrow. "A reputation?" Caleb took a seat on a nearby rock, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "Stories, old ones, about the Watchers." The Watchers? I couldn't help but smile. It sounded like something out of a campfire tale. "Guardians of the land," he said. "They don't like trespassers, not unless you show respect." I laughed nervously. "Respect? Like what? Cleaning up after myself?" Caleb didn't laugh. "It's more than that. They demand balance. You take something, you give something, you break the balance, and—" He trailed off, his gaze shifting to the trees. "Well, you don't want to break it." His tone sent a chill down my spine. "Is this some local superstition?" "Call it what you want," he said, standing. Just be careful, Ryan, and don't wander after dark." He disappeared into the woods as silently as he'd arrived. That night, I sat by the campfire reviewing my photos. The stars were breathtaking, and I'd managed a few decent shots despite the earlier battery mishap. But as I scrolled through the images, one made my stomach drop. In the background of one frame, just beyond the tree line, was a figure. A tall, shadowy silhouette standing perfectly still. I flipped to the next photo. The figure was closer. I whipped my head around, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The forest was silent, the shadows impossibly deep. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the trees. Nothing. Just empty woods. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a smudge on the lens. But as I crawled into the RV later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I decided to explore the surrounding trails, hoping to shake off the unease from the night before. The forest was beautiful, its towering pines stretching endlessly into the sky, but the further I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the wilderness, birdsong, rustling leaves, were absent. Even my footsteps felt muffled, swallowed by the earth. About an hour in, I noticed something odd. My compass, which had been clipped to my pack, wasn't pointing north anymore. The needle spun lazily, as if caught in a magnetic field. I frowned, pulling out my phone to check the GPS, but it wouldn't load. Just a blank screen. Then I heard it. Faint rustling like footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see another hiker, but the trail was empty. "Caleb," I called, my voice sounding small in the stillness. No answer. I pressed on, but the feeling of being followed only grew stronger. At one point, I glanced back and saw a footprint in the dirt, a single large print that hadn't been there seconds before. My pulse quickened, and I picked up my pace, heading back toward camp. By the time I returned, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the clearing. Caleb was sitting by my fire pit, poking the embers with a stick. "You wandered," he said without looking up. "I didn't see anything," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You weren't meant to." He tossed the stick into the fire and stood, his expression grim. "They're warning you." "Who?" I snapped. "The Watchers?" Caleb nodded. "They don't like outsiders poking around. They're testing you now." "Testing me for what?" "To see what you'll give," he said. "You've already taken something, their peace. They'll want something in return." His words made my skin crawl. What does that even mean? "You'll find out soon enough," Caleb said. Then, as if sensing my rising panic, he added, "Just stay by the fire tonight. They don't come near the light." That night, I stayed close to the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across the trees. But the shadows didn't stay where they belonged. At the edge of the clearing, they moved against the firelight, tall and thin, their forms flickering like smoke. The Watchers. They didn't come closer, but their presence was suffocating. I could feel their eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, fixed on me, unblinking and relentless. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The shadows didn't respond. Instead, the fire dimmed, the flames sputtering as if struggling for air. The Watchers inched closer, their forms solidifying. And then I understood. I grabbed my camera, my prized possession, and held it up. "Is this what you want?" My voice trembled, but I didn't care. "Take it!" The shadows paused. The fire flared briefly, and I hurled the camera into the flames. The plastic and metal hissed and popped as the heat consumed it. The watchers retreated, their forms dissolving into the trees. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time since I'd arrived, the forest felt alive again. The wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere in the distance I heard the call of an owl. By dawn, I was packed and ready to leave. Caleb was gone, his campsite empty as if he'd never been there. I didn't look for him. I didn't want to know. As I drove away, the forest seemed to watch me, its shadows stretching long across the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the towering pines replaced by open desert. I developed the photos from my trip a week later. Most were normal, stunning shots of the night sky. But one image made my blood run cold. A single frame of the clearing with the watchers standing just beyond the firelight. And in the corner, Caleb was there too. His face blurred, his eyes empty. I never went back to the forest. Some things are better left undisturbed, and some debts are too dangerous to repay. The Black Canyon of the Gunnison was unlike any place I'd ever been. Its cliffs didn't just rise, they loomed, jagged and unyielding, as if daring anyone to step closer. The Gunnison River roared far below, its voice a constant guttural growl. For some, this place might have been intimidating. For me, it felt like the perfect place to face myself. I parked my RV near the rim of the canyon, a solitary spot offering a view that was both breathtaking and oppressive. The shadows stretched long across the gorge as the sun sank lower, casting the narrow walls into an early twilight. It suited me. Shadows and isolation, that was all I deserved. I didn't come here to relax, I came to forget. The first night, the silence gnawed at me. I tried to distract myself by going over my gear, rope, climbing harness, first aid kit, old habits. Back when I was still with search and rescue, my gear had been my lifeline, but even the best gear couldn't save everyone. I lay in the bunk, staring at the RV's ceiling as the river's echo filled the night. I'd read about the canyon's strange acoustics, how the sound bounced off the walls in ways that disoriented even experienced hikers. They said you could hear whispers that weren't there, voices calling from nowhere. I told myself it was just the wind. It had to be. Then I heard it. A voice, faint but distinct, cutting through the canyon's growl. "Mark." I sat up, my chest tightening. It wasn't just any voice. It was her voice. The next morning, I met Elena Price, a park ranger stationed near the visitor center. She was sharp-eyed with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of some of the rangers I used to work with. "Planning to go down into the canyon?" she asked, nodding toward my climbing harness. "Just exploring," I said. She frowned. "Be careful on the trails. They're narrow, and the acoustics can mess with your head. People hear things." I nodded, but something in her tone caught my attention. "You mean the whispers?" Her gaze flicked toward the canyon. "It's not just whispers. Some people see things too. Shadows, figures. Most of the time, they disappear." Her words settled uncomfortably in my gut. "You believe that?" "I've seen enough not to dismiss it," she said. "Just stay on the marked paths. And if you hear something that doesn't feel right, turn back." I didn't take her advice. By midday, I was deep into the canyon, following a narrow trail that wound its way down to the river. The air grew cooler as I descended, the sunlight fading to a dim gray. The further I went, the louder the river's roar became, but beneath it I heard something else, a low, rhythmic hum, like the canyon itself was breathing. I paused to catch my breath, looking out over the churning water below. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh and distinct, leading away from the trail. They were too large to be mine, and they stopped abruptly at the edge of a cliff. A chill crept over me, but I pressed on. The first shadow appeared as I reached the riverbank. It was faint at first, just a flicker on the canyon wall, but as I moved, it grew clearer. A tall, indistinct figure standing motionless across the river. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Hello?" I called. The figure didn't move. I crossed the river on a narrow rock bridge, my boots splashing in the shallows. But when I reached the other side, the shadow was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a distortion from the canyon walls, but as I turned back toward the trail, I saw something carved into the rock. A single word scratched deep into the stone. Why? By the time I made it back to the rim, the sun was setting. Elena was waiting for me, her arms crossed. "Where'd you go?" she asked. "Down to the river," I said. Her expression hardened. "I told you to stay on the trails." "I did," I lied. She shook her head. "The canyon's not just a place. It gets inside your head. You're lucky it let you come back." "Let me?" I scoffed. "It's a canyon, not a haunted house." She didn't argue, but her silence was worse. That night, the voices returned, louder, closer. "Mark, why did you let me go?" I bolted upright, the words cutting through the darkness like a blade. The voice was so familiar it made my chest ache. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The gorge stretched out before me, a yawning black void. The wind howled through the cliffs, carrying the faint, unmistakable sound of someone crying. I followed the sound, my flashlight sweeping over the rocks. As I reached the edge of the rim, I saw her. She was standing on the far side of the canyon, her figure pale and ghostly against the dark cliffs. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I knew who she was. "Anna?" My voice cracked. She turned toward me, her face blurred by distance but unmistakable. And then she was gone. I didn't sleep. By dawn, I was already halfway down the canyon, retracing my steps from the day before. I didn't care how dangerous it was, or how foolish I looked. I had to know if she was real. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became. The canyon walls seemed to press closer, the shadows growing darker. I saw flickers of movement at the edge of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Then the shadow appeared. It rose from the canyon floor like smoke, its form shifting and flickering. It was tall and featureless, but its presence was suffocating. The air grew colder, and the shadows around me seemed to writhe and twist. "You can't save her," it whispered, its voice deep and resonant. "You never could." My breath caught, my chest tightening as the memory flooded back. The storm, the fall, the rescue that ended too late. I'd tried to save Anna, but I'd failed. The shadow knew. "You let her fall," it hissed. "No!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I did everything I could!" The shadow loomed closer, its form expanding until it blotted out the cliffs. It showed me the moment again, over and over. The slip, the scream, the silence that followed. It wasn't just a memory. It was real, and I was living it. Then I heard her voice. "Mark." It was soft, barely audible over the shadow's growl, but it was enough. I turned, and there she was again, standing on the trail, her figure glowing faintly. "You have to let go," she said. Tears blurred my vision. "I can't." The shadow shrieked, its form collapsing inward as Anna reached for me. Her touch was warm, solid, and in that moment, the weight I'd carried for years lifted. "I forgive you," she said, and then she was gone. The shadow dissolved into the canyon, its form scattering like smoke. I staggered back to the rim, my legs trembling and my chest hollow. Elena found me there, her face pale. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak. She didn't press for details. Instead, she helped me back to the RV, her presence grounding me as the canyon's whispers faded into silence. I left the Black Canyon the next morning, the shadows still heavy in my mind. But for the first time in years, I felt lighter. I don't know if the shadow will ever return, or if it's still lurking in the gorge, waiting for its next victim. But I do know this. Some places don't just test your strength, they test your soul, and not everyone makes it out. The wind was my only audience, and the dunes stretched out like waves frozen in time. I came here for inspiration, for a spark. For months, I'd been chasing silence in all the wrong places, hoping it would let the music come back. But silence never came. Instead, there was a void, gnawing at me like a predator waiting to pounce. The great sand dunes seemed like the perfect escape. Vast, desolate, untouched. And the idea of the singing sands, that was the hook. I told myself the sound would help. Maybe the hum of the dunes could shake loose whatever was stuck inside me. Maybe I could write again. That's how I ended up in an overheated RV at the edge of a sea of sand, the mountains towering behind me like guardians that didn't care. The first night, the hum began. At first, I thought it was the wind, scraping over the dunes, but then it deepened, a low, resonant note that seemed to come from the earth itself. It wasn't random either. It pulsed, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. I stepped outside, barefoot in the cool sand, and listened. The sound wrapped around me, almost tangible, filling the air with something I couldn't name. It was beautiful, but there was an edge to it, a dissonance that made my skin crawl. The next morning, I met Sammy. He was perched on a rock near the visitor center, a skinny kid in a too-big park volunteer vest. He waved as I approached, his smile as bright as the sun glaring off the dunes. "First time here?" he asked, hopping down to meet me. "Yeah," I said, glancing at the ridge behind him. "I heard about the singing sands. Thought I'd check it out." Sammy's grin faded. "You heard the hum?" "Last night," I said. "It's something else." His eyes darted toward the dunes, and he lowered his voice. "You didn't follow it, did you?" I frowned. "Follow it? No, why?" His hands fidgeted with the edge of his vest. "It gets louder if you do. Louder and different." "Different how?" He shrugged, his shoulders rising and falling in a way that felt rehearsed. "It just does. Anyway, stick to the main trails. People get lost out there." "Thanks for the tip," I said, already walking away. Something about the way he avoided my gaze unsettled me. That evening, the hum came back. This time, it wasn't just sound. It was a melody. Faint, just on the edge of hearing, but unmistakable. It was the kind of tune that sank its teeth into your mind, refusing to let go. I grabbed my recorder, pressing it to the open window, but when I played it back, all I heard was static. Frustrated, I went outside carrying my guitar. Maybe I could play along, find the harmony, and draw it out. But as I sat on the sand, my fingers froze. The hum had shifted again. It wasn't just random notes, it was familiar. The melody was one of mine, an old song I hadn't played in years. I stood, scanning the horizon. "Who's out there?" The dunes didn't answer, but the melody swirled around me, wrapping me in something cold and wrong. I retreated to the RV, locking the door behind me. The next morning, Sammy appeared at my campsite. "You okay?" he asked, leaning against the side of the RV. I shook my head. "Something weird's going on." He nodded, his expression somber. "The dunes are strange. You should leave." "I can't," I said. "I need to know what's out there." He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder like he was afraid someone might overhear. "The hum? It's not just sound. It's alive. It pulls you in, makes you forget why you came." I studied him, the shadows under his eyes, the way his fingers twitched against the metal siding. "You followed it, haven't you?" Sammy didn't answer. Instead, he said, "If you go out there, you'll find people. Wanderers, artists, they didn't leave. They can't." That night, I ignored his warning. The hum was louder now, undeniable. It called to me, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I grabbed my flashlight and recorder and started walking, the cool sand shifting under my boots. The melody grew stronger with each step, leading me away from the familiar paths. The stars blazed above me, bright and cold, but they didn't light my way. The dunes rose and fell, endless and alien, until I wasn't sure which direction I'd come from. But the hum was there, guiding me. I stumbled into a hollow, the sand pressed flat and smooth, like the surface of a frozen lake. The hum reached a crescendo, and then it stopped. The silence was deafening. That's when I saw them. Figures half buried in the dunes, their faces pale and drawn. They moved slowly, aimlessly, like ghosts in a dream. One of them turned toward me, and I gasped. It was my face. I ran. The sand grabbed at my boots, the dunes shifting as if they were alive. The hum returned, louder and more chaotic, drowning out my thoughts. I tripped, falling hard, and when I looked up, she was there. The Siren. She wasn't human, not really. Her form flickered, made of sand and wind, shifting with every breath. Her voice was the hum itself, resonant and irresistible. "You've come so far," she said, her voice a melody that wrapped around my mind. "Stay." I shook my head, struggling to my feet. "What are you?" She tilted her head, her face blurring into something almost familiar. "I am the song. I am what you seek." "No," I said, backing away. "I just wanted to hear it." "You've already heard it," she said, stepping closer, "and now it will be yours." Her voice grew sharper, her form stretching toward me. My head ached, the hum splitting into dissonant chords that tore through my mind. I fell to my knees, clutching my ears. "You'll stay," she whispered. "They always stay." Desperate, I reached for my guitar, slung over my back. My fingers fumbled on the strings, strumming a jumbled, discordant tune. The siren recoiled, her form rippling like a mirage. I played harder, finding a rhythm, a melody that clashed with her song. The hum faltered, breaking apart into fractured notes. The siren screamed, her voice splintering into the wind, and then she was gone. I stumbled back to the RV at dawn, exhausted and hollow. Sammy was waiting, his face pale. "You made it," he said, relief flooding his voice. I nodded, collapsing onto the steps. "She's real." "I know," he said quietly. "I told you." I didn't ask how he knew, didn't want to hear what it cost him. I packed up that morning, leaving the dunes behind, but the hum followed me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear it again, faint and distant, pulling at the edges of my mind. And I wonder if I really escaped, or if she's just waiting for me to come back. Maps were my life. I'd spent years sketching trails, charting landmarks, and measuring distances down to the smallest fraction of an inch. To me, a map wasn't just a tool, it was order, proof that the world could be contained and understood. So when my project in Sawtooth National Forest took an unexpected turn, I wasn't prepared. What I found there, what found me, has left me questioning everything. It started with a lake that wasn't supposed to exist. The locals had been cryptic when I asked about the area I planned to map. At the diner near the forest's edge, an older man shook his head when I showed him my notes. "You're not gonna find it on any map," he said, chewing his toothpick slowly. "And you won't want to find it at all." "What are you talking about?" I asked. "The lake," he said simply, his eyes narrowing. "You'll see, or you won't. Best not to go looking." I'd heard my fair share of superstitious nonsense while charting trails. I figured this was no different. A bit of local lore, nothing more. Still, his warning stuck with me as I loaded up my gear and headed deeper into the forest. My first 2 days were uneventful. I followed established trails, marking my progress with GPS and detailed sketches. The Sawtooth Range was breathtaking. Snow-capped peaks, dense pine forests, and crystalline rivers. It was the kind of place that made you feel small in the best way. On the 3rd day, things began to shift. I'd been mapping a series of switchbacks near a steep ravine when my GPS started glitching. The screen flickered, showing my location as a blank void. My compass wasn't much better. Its needle spun erratically, refusing to settle. Then I noticed the birds, or rather the lack of them. The forest had gone silent, the usual chirps and rustles replaced by an oppressive stillness. Even the air felt different, heavier somehow. That's when I saw the trail. It wasn't on my map. Narrow and overgrown, it branched off from the main path and wound down into the trees. My first instinct was to ignore it. I had enough work to do without chasing phantom trails. But something about it drew me in. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The lake appeared suddenly, as though it had been waiting for me. One moment, I was weaving through dense underbrush. The next, I was standing on its shore. It was small, no more than 100 feet across, and surrounded by jagged cliffs that loomed like silent sentinels. The water was so still it looked like glass, perfectly reflecting the sky above. It was beautiful in an unsettling way, but it wasn't the lake's stillness that unnerved me. It was my reflection. I stepped closer, leaning over the edge to get a better look. My face stared back at me, but something was off. The reflection lingered a beat too long after I moved. Its eyes locked on mine as though it were studying me. I pulled back, my pulse quickening. "It's just the light," I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. "An optical illusion." But deep down, I didn't believe that. I returned to my campsite shaken, though I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard a branch snap nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees, half expecting to see a deer or a raccoon. Instead, a man stepped into the light. He was older, maybe 50, with a scruffy beard and a weathered jacket. He smiled when he saw me, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Evan," he said, as though we were old friends. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my grip tightening on the flashlight. "I saw your name on your map earlier," he said, gesturing toward the notebook sitting on the table beside me. "Name's Ray. I'm camping just up the trail." I didn't remember meeting anyone on the trail, let alone showing them my map, but before I could question him further, he pointed toward the woods. "You been down to the lake yet?" I hesitated. "Yeah. Figures." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You might want to steer clear of it from now on. People don't come back the same." "What does that mean?" I asked. Ray shook his head. "Just keep your wits about you, Evan. The lake's got a way of taking things." The next morning, I met Sophie. She was crouched on the edge of the trail, adjusting the lens of her camera as the sunlight filtered through the trees. She looked up when she heard me approach, her face breaking into a friendly smile. "Hey there," she said. "You must be the map guy." "Word travels fast," I said, offering a small smile in return. "You out here for the scenery?" "Something like that." She gestured toward her camera. "I heard there's a lake nearby. Thought I'd check it out." At the mention of the lake, my stomach tightened. "It's not what you'd expect," I said cautiously. Sophie frowned. "What do you mean?" Before I could answer, she held up her camera, scrolling through the photos she'd taken that morning. "Check this out. Tell me if it looks weird to you." The photo showed the lake, its surface as mirror-like as I remembered. But standing at the edge of the water was a figure, a man. "It's you, isn't it?" she said, glancing at me. I stared at the photo, my blood running cold. The figure did look like me. Same height, same build, but its posture was wrong, stiff and unnatural, and its face wasn't quite right. "I wasn't there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Sophie's smile faded. "Maybe we should stay away from the lake." That night, the lake came to me. I was in the RV reviewing my sketches when I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. No one should have been out here. Not Sophie, not Ray, not anyone. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, my hands shaking. No one was there. Then I heard it. A voice calling my name from the direction of the lake. My voice. "Evan." I stepped outside, the flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the darkness. The voice came again, low and insistent, drawing me closer. When I reached the lake, it was waiting for me. The doppelganger stood at the water's edge, its back to me. It was identical to me in every way, same build, same clothes, but there was something wrong about it. Its movements were too deliberate, its head cocked at an unnatural angle as it turned to face me. "I've been waiting," it said, its voice eerily calm. "What are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. It smiled, a twisted parody of my own expression. "I'm you, the you that belongs here." "No," I said, taking a step back. "You're not real." "Aren't I?" it asked, tilting its head. "I know you, Evan. I know your fear of losing control, your need to make everything fit, but not everything fits, does it?" My chest tightened as it stepped closer, its movement slow and deliberate. "Give me your life," it said. "Let me take your place." I stumbled back, the edge of the lake looming behind me. The doppelganger's smile widened as it reached for me, its hand cold and unyielding. In that moment, something inside me snapped. "No," I said, my voice steady now, "you're not taking anything." I grabbed the notebook from my pocket, the one filled with my sketches, my attempts to impose order on this chaos, and hurled it into the lake. The water erupted, the reflection shattering as the doppelganger let out a piercing scream. When the lake stilled, the doppelganger was gone. I stood there, my chest heaving as the forest seemed to exhale around me. The next morning, the lake was gone. In its place was an empty clearing, the grass flattened as though something massive had been dragged away. I left Sawtooth that day, my maps unfinished, but as I drove away, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror. It smiled, but I didn't. The RV rattled over the gravel road as I turned onto a barely visible trailhead in Monongahela National Forest. The trees crowded closer as I drove deeper into the woods, their dark, twisted branches reaching toward the fading light. I wasn't even sure why I was here, only that I needed to get away from the life I'd left behind. Emma would have laughed at the idea of me camping alone. She used to joke that I was allergic to nature, always choosing the comfort of four walls over the unpredictable outdoors. But Emma was gone now, and the walls of our house had become unbearable. So here I was, parked in the middle of nowhere, hoping that solitude could numb the ache that had settled in my chest since the accident. I stepped out of the RV into crisp, pine-scented air. The clearing was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint hum of the wind. It was peaceful, I told myself, unloading my gear and setting up camp. But even then, a nagging unease tugged at the edges of my mind. As I finished setting up, a figure emerged from the trees. He was an older man, maybe 60, dressed in a ranger's uniform that looked as worn as his face. He carried a clipboard under one arm and approached with a gait that was more purposeful than friendly. "Evening," he said, his voice gravelly. "Didn't think anyone would be camping this far out." "Just looking for some quiet," I said. "I needed a break from everything." He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the RV and the clearing. "You'll get quiet all right. But there are places in this forest you'd do well to avoid, like the glade." "The glade?" I asked, frowning. He pointed to the trail winding into the woods behind my campsite. "Just down that path. Doesn't look like much, but folks who wander there don't come back the same, if they come back at all." "What happens there?" I asked, trying to sound skeptical instead of nervous. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he gave me a long, unreadable look and said, "Some places don't belong to us. Best leave them be." And then he was gone, disappearing into the trees as abruptly as he'd arrived. I spent the night trying to shake off the ranger's cryptic warning. The forest seemed to press in closer as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretching long and thin across the clearing. Inside the RV, I busied myself with a cup of instant coffee and some half-hearted attempts at journaling, but the silence outside felt heavy, as though the forest were holding its breath. Just before midnight, the generator cut out. The hum of electricity gave way to an oppressive stillness, and the lights in the RV flickered before plunging me into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, cursing under my breath. That's when I saw her. She stumbled into the clearing from the direction of the trail, her clothes torn and her face pale. Her hair hung in matted strands around her shoulders, and she looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Help me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" I asked, rushing toward her. "I got lost," she said, clutching my arm. Her fingers were ice cold. "I've been out here for weeks." "Weeks?" I said, glancing at her clothes. They looked old, as though they'd been worn for years rather than weeks. Her backpack was faded and frayed, and her hiking boots were caked with mud. "I didn't mean to go to the glade," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know." "What happened there?" I asked. Her grip on my arm tightened. "Don't go. Don't let it take you." The next morning, the woman was gone. I woke up to find the clearing empty, no sign of her except for a faint trail of footprints leading back into the forest. I should have left right then, packed up and driven away without looking back. But something about her warning, something about the way she'd said the glade, stuck with me. I grabbed my flashlight and a water bottle and headed down the trail she'd come from. The path wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and darker with every step. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive, as though the forest were swallowing the sounds around me. When I reached the glade, I knew immediately that I'd made a mistake. It was a perfect circle, surrounded by trees that seemed older and taller than any I'd ever seen. Their branches twisted into strange, unnatural shapes, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. In the center of the glade, the grass grew impossibly green, swaying gently despite the lack of wind. And there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a figure cloaked in shimmering light. The Watcher was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its form was humanoid but indistinct, as though it were made of liquid light that constantly shifted and flowed. It didn't move, but I felt its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. "Adam." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, soft and familiar. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Adam, help me!" It was Emma's voice. "No," I whispered, backing away. "You're not real." The Watcher tilted its head as though studying me. The light around it flickered, and suddenly I was no longer in the glade. I was back in the car, Emma in the passenger seat, her laughter filling the air as we drove down the rain-slick road. The crash happened just as I remembered. The headlights of the oncoming truck, the screech of tires, the shattering of glass. And then the silence. The terrible, suffocating silence. "You could have saved her," the voice whispered, and I turned to see the Watcher standing in the wreckage, its featureless face turned toward me. I stumbled back into the glade, gasping for air. My hands were trembling, my mind reeling from the vision. But the Watcher was still there, its shimmering form pulsing with light. "Stay," it said, its voice shifting into a chorus of whispers. "Relive the moment. Relive your failure." "No," I said, my voice shaken. "I won't." The ground beneath me seemed to ripple, the grass twisting and writhing as though alive. The Watcher raised a hand, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, the memories of the crash flooding back with unbearable clarity. "Let me go," I said, my voice breaking. "It wasn't my fault." The light around the Watcher dimmed for a moment, flickering like a candle in the wind. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the locket I'd carried since Emma's death, a small silver keepsake with her photo inside. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face, "but I have to let you go." With trembling hands, I threw the locket into the glade. The grass erupted in flames, and the watcher let out a sound that wasn't a scream, but something far worse. A low, guttural roar that shook the ground beneath my feet. I ran. The forest twisted around me, the trees closing in as though trying to trap me. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The trail blurred, the world spinning, and then I was in the clearing again, the RV just ahead. I threw myself into the driver's seat and started the engine, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. The RV roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, the forest blurring past me. When I finally reached the highway, the weight on my chest lifted, and I let out a shaky breath. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it. The watcher standing at the edge of the forest, its shimmering form fading into the trees. I didn't come to Palo Duro Canyon looking for ghosts. I came for history, to uncover the truth about Red Hollow, a settlement whose name had all but disappeared from the record books. It was supposed to be just another solo trip for my research, a chance to gather material for the article I'd been promising myself I'd write. But by the end, I'd wish I'd never come. The locals weren't much help. When I stopped at a diner near the park entrance, the mention of Red Hollow earned me little more than uneasy stares and muttered warnings. Only the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, spoke up. "Nothing left there but bad memories," she said, sliding me my coffee. "You'd do well to leave it alone." "Thanks," I said, forcing a smile, "but I'll take my chances." The last words she said before I left chilled me more than I wanted to admit. It watches. I reached the canyon by midday, the RV rattling along the dirt roads until I found a secluded spot to park. The air was crisp, the sun high, and the canyon spread out around me like a painted landscape, its red rock formations casting jagged shadows over the desert floor. But even in the daylight, there was something oppressive about the place. The silence felt alive, as though the land itself were listening. I set up my camp quickly, eager to start exploring. The trail to Red Hollow wasn't on any official map, but I'd pieced together enough clues from old newspapers and online forums to know where to look. With my notebook, camera, and water bottle in hand, I set off into the canyon. The hike was harder than I expected. The trail, if you could even call it that, was little more than an overgrown path winding through the rocks. Every step felt like an effort, the uneven ground threatening to twist my ankle at any moment. And then there were the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the words were too distinct, carried on the breeze in a way that made my skin crawl. They weren't loud enough to understand, just soft murmurs that stopped every time I turned to look behind me. By the time I reached Red Hollow, the sun was sinking low, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. The settlement was exactly as I'd imagined it, a cluster of crumbling cabins, their wooden walls weathered to a ghostly gray. In the center of it all stood a small chapel, its roof sagging under the weight of time. I stepped inside, the wooden floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was cooler here, the shadows longer. The walls were covered in carvings, names, dates, and phrases that made my stomach twist. "Stay away. It watches. Run." I was so focused on the carvings that I didn't notice the figure standing in the corner until I turned around. "Jesus!" I yelped, nearly dropping my notebook. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his face lined with years of sun and wind. He wore a park ranger's uniform, though it looked as weathered as the buildings around us. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I didn't see any signs," I said, trying to steady my breathing. "You don't need signs to know some places aren't meant for visitors," he said. "This land has a memory, and it doesn't forget." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked out of the chapel, disappearing into the twilight. Something told me not to follow. That night, I met Anna. I was sitting by the fire, going over my notes, when I heard footsteps approaching. I looked up to see a woman in her early 30s, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. She carried a sketch pad and a lantern, her expression cautious but curious. "You're the guy asking about Red Hollow, right?" she said. "Depends," I said. "Are you here to warn me off, too?" She smiled faintly. "Something like that." Anna was an artist, she told me, camping nearby to capture the canyon's beauty. But when I mentioned Red Hollow, her face darkened. "I've never been there," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I've dreamt about it. The chapel, the carvings, the thing that lives there. It's like it's been calling to me." "What kind of thing?" I asked, my stomach tightening. She hesitated. "I don't know, but it's not human." The next day, I returned to Red Hollow. I knew I should have stayed away, but curiosity pulled me back, stronger than any fear I felt. This time, the trail seemed different, longer, more twisted, as though the canyon itself were trying to lead me astray. By the time I reached the settlement, the sky was overcast, the light flat and gray. Inside the chapel, the air felt heavier, colder. The carvings on the walls seemed deeper, more vivid, as though they'd been etched just hours ago. I stepped closer to inspect them. That's when I heard it. "Elliot!" I froze. The voice was low and familiar, coming from the direction of the altar. It couldn't be. "Dr. Harper?" I whispered. Dr. Samuel Harper had been my mentor in graduate school, the man who taught me everything I knew about history and research. He died 10 years ago, a heart attack in his office. And yet, I heard his voice now, as clear as if he were standing in front of me. "Come closer," the voice said, and my legs moved before I could stop them. At the altar, I found an old journal, its leather cover cracked and brittle. I flipped it open, the pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. It was Dr. Harper's handwriting. As I read, the room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching and twisting around me. The journal spoke of the settlers' final days, how they'd turned on each other, driven mad by whispers and visions. And then came the last entry. It watches. It waits. It wants us all. A cold wind rushed through the chapel, extinguishing the light. When I turned around, the specter was there. It stood in the doorway, tall and pale, its face smooth and featureless. Its presence filled the room, an oppressive weight that pressed down on my chest. It didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, as though it were pulling me closer. "Elliot!" The voice came again, but this time it wasn't Dr. Harper. It was my own voice, distorted and wrong. I stumbled back, dropping the journal, and bolted out of the chapel. The settlement was unrecognizable now, the cabins leaning at impossible angles, the sky above a swirling mass of black clouds. I ran blindly, the specter's presence pressing against me, its whispers growing louder with every step. "You can't leave," it said. "You belong to the canyon now." When I finally burst into the clearing where my RV was parked, I found Anna waiting for me, her face pale and drawn. "You saw it, didn't you?" she said. "It's real," I gasped. "It's all real." "You have to let it go," she said, stepping closer. "Whatever it's using against you, your guilt, your regrets, you have to let it go. That's how it keeps you trapped." Her words echoed in my head as I stumbled into the RV. I grabbed my notebook and stared at the pages filled with my research, my sketches, my plans. All the things I'd been clinging to, trying to prove myself, trying to make up for my failures. With shaking hands, I tossed the notebook into the fire pit outside. The flames roared to life, brighter and hotter than they should have been. The specter's whispers turned to screams, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt, the ground buckling beneath my feet. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. The next morning, the canyon was quiet again. Anna was gone, her campsite empty, but I found a sketch she'd left behind, a haunting image of the chapel with the specter standing in the doorway. I packed up and drove away, the memories of Red Hollow already fading like a dream. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it, a pale figure standing at the edge of the road, watching me go.